Well, Psalm 77, which you just read together, starts in a place that I wonder how many of you, if you were courageous, would admit to knowing really all too well: a restless and sleepless and anxious night. I think many of us know what that's like. I certainly do. Imagine it's kind of 2 or 3 a.m. That's the worst, isn't it? 2 or 3 a.m. and your mind won't settle and your heart's racing because perhaps you're facing a situation or a fear or a threat that threatens to overwhelm you. That's where Psalm 77 starts. But to get us started today, I want to tell you a story of my own, because with all this talk of remembering, here's the first bit of wisdom I discovered, which was, it's not just remember anything, it's be careful what you remember. Now, some of you know that I grew up in Africa, in the wonderful country of Malawi in central southern Africa. But as I hit the age of 12, I moved back to the UK to get ready for my high school years. And I ended up at a prestigious British secondary school. I feel like I'm a walking stereotype in your imaginations. Because all of them are as prestigious because you're English, I don't know. But in theory, that meant that I was set for an awesome education and a very bright, success-filled future. But those first couple of years were really, really tough ones for me because I was bullied, not physically, but verbally and constantly. I want you to picture a classroom of 32 boys aged 12 and 13. that was a guttural response. I wasn't expecting that. But I want you to picture it with reality and compassion. But picture it, 30, it was a boys-only school. And everyone in that room, imagine them being insecure, as you are when you're 12 and 13. Doubting if they are enough. Terrified that their inadequacy will be spotted by others. And everyone is desperately trying hard to figure out where they fit. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Is this realistic, right? And into that kind of environment, it seems to me, particularly if the school culture doesn't care or doesn't notice this happening, a pack culture can form. And a few leaders emerge, and the group quickly learns that if their own insecurities are hidden because the insecurity is focused on the weaker links in the chain, then everyone else gets to stay fit as long as the group's vitriol and insecurity is focused on those unfortunate one or two. And it's my story, not said for your pity, but just said for your interest and to connect to the theme today, that I became one of those misfits because I didn't understand the culture well enough. I had grown up in this idyllic, central, very poor but very idyllic central southern African country with people from all the corners of the earth figuring out how to live together for the benefit of some of the poorest people in the world. And the sun was golden, and the sunsets would take your breath away. And the people were some of the kindest people I have to this day ever met in my life. And I came out of that sort of environment, which had its challenges too, as every country has its challenges. But I knew that culture. I knew how life worked there. But I didn't know how life worked over here. And so I made a few innocent mistakes, and that was enough for me to be singled out. And so I got to experience what being targeted and mocked and laughed at on a daily basis felt like. A place that should have been safe and nurturing for me became a place of survival and pain. I don't know if you can relate to any of that. Now that bullying thankfully subsided after about 2 years, and after that time my life did become measurably better. But that experience taught me something. Not a good lesson. Here's the lesson it taught me. Every place in life has threats that can hurt you. Some of these threats you will know and be able to spot when they are far off. But beware, because other threats are hidden, and unless you look really carefully, they will get you. So, 13-year-old me, stay vigilant. Can you see how that lesson would come from that experience? But I know this is horrible advice, but to my 13-year-old self, it seemed like a really smart way to avoid more pain. So I learned how to watch the room. I became an expert in knowing what people expected of me. In fact, I knew it before they did. And so I learned how to play roles. I learned how to scan faces. But here's another thing that I learned, and this has dogged me my whole adult life. I learned how to imagine the worst outcomes before they arrived so that I could try my best to avoid or mitigate them. For a long time, I thought this constant threat scanning was entirely normal human behavior. In a way, there's something of that inner world that the psalmist describes at the beginning of the psalm. He has a body and a mind that is so shaped by trouble that he cannot be comforted because the past hurts, the present aches, and the future looks bleak. Now, I mention this to you because as I reflect on my story many years later, I realize that the past has this irritating tendency to not remain in the past. It pushes its pain and its fear into our present. And it can shape how we live. It can shape what we expect from people and how we imagine the future. I've even come to realize that I still see the world through a lens of threat management, can I call it that? Because of a traumatic experience that happened 36 years ago. The problem with living like that is that fear ends up guiding our decisions and shaping our imaginations. And those of us, and there are many of you here, I don't want a show of hands, I just want you to know that you are seen and you are valued. But those of you who struggle today with great anxiety will know what I mean too well. And if that's you, I want you to know that you matter and you are not alone. And I also want you to know, as we're going to unpack in a second, that your anxiety will not have the last word. But there's a saying that anxiety lives in imagined futures. Anxiety lives in imagined futures. One lesson that past pain tries to teach us is the best way to stay safe is to control our environment by imagining worst-case scenarios so that we can try to mitigate or avoid them. How good are you at imagining worst-case scenarios? Some of you are experts. I speak as a master catastrophizer. My wife will tell you, and I give her permission to do so after the service, if you want to find out how this works out, I struggle with this. This is some of the legacy of those 2 years of bullying, that I am an expert catastrophizer. I can imagine the worst case of everything. The trouble is that I don't just imagine the worst and then the best case. I go to the worst case, and then I inflate it so it's all that I can see. Do you know that feeling? Catastrophizers unite. In therapy, probably. I don't know. But here's my point. If you have suffered in your past, I want to say out loud something you know deep down, that your memory can shape your present and your future, and not always in a good way. And that brings us back to Psalm 77 again. 2 quick things I want to note real fast. First, this psalm starts very honestly in the midst of real pain and trauma and anxiety. And I love that because it reminds me that when I'm anxious, I'm not the only one. It's such a part of the human condition that the Bible sees fit to include lots of representative examples. But it's the trick of your mind that says when you're anxious, you're the only one who will get this. Nobody else knows what it is like. And that then makes you feel isolated and alone. But the truth is, we get it. The Bible understands it. God knows it. And if you feel it, I want you to first of all realize you're not alone. But instead of catastrophizing as a way of coping or preempting, the Bible, and this psalm in particular, digs into memories of who God is and how he helped save people in the past. That, my friends, is a very different way of remembering. It's a very different way of thinking about the future. It's one that doesn't allow the present to be shaped by fear, but by faith and good memory. That God is good, that God rescued us in the past, that he provided and protected and sustained in the past, and therefore he will again because he does not change. That is great remembering. It's taken me a long time to start the practice of great remembering to counteract my habit of terrible remembering. The second thing I want to note quickly, and this really surprised me when I found it out, it's really obvious when I think about it, but I just never said it out loud before, was I want to note that this psalm, as all the psalms were written by Israel's official worship leading team. And they were written as corporate hymns for the nation to sing together. I think the fact that so many psalms talk about I and me implicitly make us think that this is the work of some, you imagine David in his kind of young shepherd herd days when he's out on a sort of romantic hillside in Judea somewhere and the sun's setting and the sheep are doing what sheep do at sunset, I don't know, and he's writing, and it's a kind of poetic solo moment. This is a song written in the tradition of Asaph. Asaph is attributed to this psalm, but they think that this was written way after his time, but in his tradition. He was a worship leader whose job it was, as one of the Levites, was to give word to the praise and worship and song singing that the nation did together. This was written as a hymn to sing, not as a private poem to appreciate privately. I'd honestly never seen that before. Does that change the way you see the psalm we read together? Perhaps we need to ask God to send us new skilled worship leaders and writers who can write us new songs to sing that tell of God's faithfulness in our times as well, that help us live with faith and not fear when life gets hard and the storms come. I do sometimes think it's interesting how one of the things that the Bible keeps asking for new things of is songs. Have you noticed that? Sing a new song to the Lord. Sing the old ones for sure. We do quite a lot of that. But let's sing new songs. So here's, for those of you who have gift of faith in praying, start praying that God would make this a church where new songs are sung and he brings along people who can write really good new songs that are good songs. Does that make sense? Pray that. Just throw that out there for you. All right. Now, I also want to note real quick that not everyone in church today has a tendency towards anxious catastrophizing like me. Like, if you're a very level-headed, matter-of-fact kind of person, I'm immensely blessed to have people in my life like that. And they kind of look at me with tender pity. I'm like, well, that's a silly way to think. If you're one of those sorts of people, or perhaps for you the issue isn't so much what you remember, it's actually what you forget. Specifically, you find it easy, to forget the stories or moments of how God has cared or guided or provided for you and for others in the past. You just find it really easy to forget that kind of stuff. And here's how this plays out. If you're a forgetter, again, you're not alone. This is why the Bible, and the Psalms particularly, is full of refrains like, remember, O my soul, like, don't forget. I was saying that to my children this week. Please don't forget your water bottle. What did you forget today? Your water bottle. Okay. Be a rememberer because we can be very forgetful. That's the point. So here's what happens if you're a forgetter. Something tough comes and hits you. Maybe it's a relationship that breaks down or a health thing that happens or just a difficult conversation. And suddenly, if you look at the panic that subsumes you, you're acting as if you didn't know that God had ever helped you at all in the past. So your peace just evaporates like the morning mist, and you're left in the middle of your fear and quaking. Not by way of a show of hands, but by a quiet internal nod of the heart. How many of you know what that's like? Either way, we come to this. If we remember selectively or poorly, or if we focus only on hard things, or if we simply forget how God has led and helped us in the past, I think we end up in the same place. When trouble hits, peace is lost, fear rules, and joy disappears. That's why the Bible keeps telling us, remember what God has done. Do not forget it. Not because he wants to treat this like a history lesson and you're going to have an exam next week, but because the remembering of how God has acted in the Bible and in your own lives is very, very powerful to set you off towards faith and against fear. Did you know that that encouragement to not forget and to keep remembering is estimated to appear in different forms of wording around 200 times in the Bible? The Bible's very realistic about how bad we are at remembering the good stuff. I think Psalm 77 holds all of this really well. The writer is honest about where they are in the moment, the crisis, and then the pivot point in the psalm goes like this: I will, not I feel like, you know, just that. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. That's just an old-fashioned way of saying in the past. In other words, the psalmist does not deny his pain. Your pain is welcome here. And in another Sunday, we're going to talk about the collective practice of lament, because healing often does not come until the pain has had a chance to be voiced out loud. Could we be a place and a people who openly invite people to express their pain without having to try and shove it under the carpet or get it dealt with? We'll come to that in a different week. The psalmist doesn't deny his pain, but he brings another story into the room of who God is that's more than a feeling. It's a choice of his will, a practice that he learns, and it leads to the heart of what I want to say today. When we forget how God has cared and guided and provided for us, fear will grow. But when we remember what he has done in the past, trust and peace grow instead. Remembering well draws us back close to God and into what is true about God. Remembering well is one of the ways God helps us stay close to him when fear gets loud. That's why Psalm 77 moves from sleepless fear to steady trust. Not because his circumstances have changed. He's still in the storm. But because the story the psalmist is remembering has changed. I want to share one more personal story as I bring this to an end. A few years ago, between the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, Angela and I were wrestling with this huge question: should we move to Canada? This question was happening in the months of COVID. Why did we ask that question in the midst of a global pandemic? Anyway, that's the question we were wrestling with. And we'd spent several months praying and talking and speaking to good people, 4 of whom are in this room right today. And I give tribute to them: Rob and Kathy Bentle and Melissa and Johnny Lockhead. And they had extended an invitation to us to consider coming and living and working in this amazing community. And so we'd spent months praying and speaking to them and others and dealing with lawyers and trying to work it all out. Because just to burst your bubble, just because I'm English doesn't mean I know the king, and it doesn't mean I have favor in Canada. I just need you to know that. People said, well, surely they like you. They just let you in, don't they? I'm like, not so much. But it was complicated, that's my point. Eventually, though, here's the truth of our journey. It became overwhelming as we tried to figure out, how do you negotiate a cross-the-world move when your kids are the age our kids are and our son's about to start high school and there's a global pandemic happening and people are dying and our families are getting older and so the fear started to fill our imagination, very reasonably so, I might add. And it got to the point where when this overwhelm hit, one day we sat on the couch together and we said, we've got to say no. So we phoned, I remember it very well, never forget this moment for the rest of my life. We phoned up Johnny and Melissa, I think, in the first instance. And I'm looking to Angela because she corrects me when I'm Irish half, and so I elaborate stories sometimes. Am I on the right track? Okay, it wasn't because of fear, it's because of the practicalities. I was, well, whatever. There was all of that. But you can appreciate how this is a big decision. And so we called, I think, Johnny and Melissa, and we basically said, thank you, but we're going to say no. We'd like you to release us from this invitation. And in huge credit to them, having spent months on this with us, they said, of course, go in peace. And they let us go. And we were on FaceTime. We shut the laptop. And this has never happened to me before nor since. But it was like the very presence of God left the room. The air was sucked out. The peace disappeared. The joy evaporated. It was the most devastating feeling, which I can't possibly explain to you. And I didn't know that sort of thing happened, but it did to us that day. And I think almost instantly we realized we've made the biggest mistake, even though our reasons were very justifiable, and that God was calling us to Canada. And that was all there was to it. So we pretty much immediately started writing an email. Dear John and Melissa, further to our conversation where we listed all the reasons why we can't do this, we have made the biggest decision, and with your grace, we would like to re-engage with this process. Sincerely and with some trepidation, Mark and Angela send. And, in great tribute to those guys, they welcomed us back into the conversation. And, the issues didn't go away. Got very complicated. It still was quite scary. And I tell you this story because sometimes God guides us by withdrawing his presence. I've never really said that out loud before. But the moment stayed with us, and we rehearsed this story as part of our family remembering together for this reason, that when things in Canada have been hard, which they have been, or when they've been lonely, which they have been, or when we have felt tired or discouraged or deeply homesick, which we have done in different times in our 4 years here so far, and where we have been tempted to wonder, did we misread this? Did we mishear God? We remember that moment. Because it anchors us in a conviction that we're not here out of our choice or our foolishness or our best ideas or somebody else's convictions, but because God led us to come, and that means he will look after us. That has been a very significant story for our family. It's lowered our fear, and it's helped us keep going, to not panic. And it's also allowed us not to have to rely on our feelings all the time. Because sometimes you don't feel great. Sometimes we miss our families and we want to go home. And then we remember this and we're like, no, we've got to stay because we're here to be obedient. And there are a lot of blessings too. Like, I don't mean to imply that you guys have made my lives miserable. I just mean to say, that it's difficult, and you'll appreciate that. So Psalm 77 shows us that remembering, a bit like those stories which are very specific, they aren't vague, they're concrete. Good remembering lands you in places. So I want to offer you 3 remembering gifts to close that I would love you to take with you. And I would love us to practice together in the weeks ahead, months ahead. First, keep remembering the moments where God clearly showed up for you. Write them down if you haven't. It's amazing what transpires when you get it out of your head and onto paper. It has greater power because you forget the detail until you try and write it down. And here's the thing, it doesn't have to be dramatic. I almost need to apologize for sharing a more dramatic story with you because that immediately makes you think, well, I don't have that kind of story. Well, maybe you do, but if you don't, I don't want you to feel like a smaller story is less interesting or impressive or real. In fact, I'm convinced that most of the time God works in little nudges and small ways, subtle ways. So perhaps remember a time when a door opened at just the right time for you, an opportunity or an answer or a response. Or perhaps a time when you prayed amidst chaos and you felt the peace of God just come and rest on you. Or perhaps that time you had a nudge that kept you from going to somewhere that would end up in your distraction and your distress, where you were protected from something. Or perhaps when you were sent for something. Don't forget. Those memories remind you that God has got you now because he held you then, he holds you now. Second gift. Remember that the second remembering gift that God gives us is in other people's of God showing up for them. I just gave you a gift of 2 of my stories. This matters because sometimes our memories personally feel too thin. Do you know what I mean by that? When your life is crowded with pain or chaos or just too much busyness, or maybe you're just bone tired, it's really hard to remember. And in those moments, somebody else's story can hold you. You can hear somebody else say, here's how God helped me, and something inside you steadies. Just by way of a nod, have you had experience of that in your life? Yeah? Not because your problem vanished, but because God feels present through the gift of someone else's story. That's why sharing testimony privately and in church and on stage and wherever else is really important. It can help displace fear and grow faith and peace in other people. Last gift, as we finish. God asks us to remember the stories of Scripture. There's a reason we keep reading Bible stories over and over again. One of them is it helps give us a long memory of good things. These stories in Scripture remind us of what God is like. They place our lives inside of His bigger, faithful story. So if you don't have a clear personal memory to lean on, if you're just at the start of your walk with God, if you don't even know if you want to do that, then the Bible offers you many, many, many stories that will tell you what this God who you're considering following looks like and how He acts. So what does this mean for us? I think it means that some of the things we do here matter more than we realize. When we read the Bible and when we share stories of God's help in our own lives, we are remembering how God has cared, provided in the past, and we're shoring up our faith for the future. And over time, my friends, remember this is a thing we do, not just you do. If we do this together and become good at remembering and sharing our remembering with each other, this will shape what this church becomes. It won't become a church where nothing bad or difficult happens, but it will be a church where pain and fear and dread will never have the final word, and where they are always counteracted with stories of peace and blessing and breakthrough. Does that make sense? Because our remembering reminds us that God is at work. Psalm 77 doesn't leave remembering as an idea, it turns it into a prayer. So I don't want to leave this as an idea either. So consider that's the sermon finished. But briefly, before we end our service together, I'd love for you to try this out with me. And I'm going to stretch our comfort zones just a teeny tiny bit. And I want to start first with a moment of quiet, just on your own, in the privacy of your own heart. I'd love if you were comfortable to close your eyes. If not, that's fine too. But just settle where you are and ask God a really simple question, whether you know Him well or not. God, would you bring to mind a moment of your past care of me? And if your mind goes blank, don't panic. That happens and that's normal. And you may instead choose to remember a story of somebody else that's been shared with you, or a story from the Bible maybe that you know, because that counts too. Borrowed memories aren't lesser. They're just as important. So let's go quiet now for just a second, just a few seconds. Make this a prayer. God, would you bring to mind one moment of your past care of me? And as we close, I want to offer a small invitation. This is not an obligation, but an invitation. If you're still exploring faith, or this feels way too personal today, please hear this clearly. You do not have to share anything. You're welcome to just sit quietly and hold privately what came to you, or just simply listen to other people. But if you'd like, here's what I'm going to push you to do right now. I'd love you to turn to one or two people near you and share in 2 sentences, note, that, not a full sermon, just 2 sentences, what came to mind that you feel comfortable sharing. If it's a memory that you don't feel comfortable sharing, don't share it. You're the judge of this. But if there's something you could share, then share it in a sentence or 2, just a moment you noticed. If you'd rather not speak, again, there's no judgment from any of us, and you can just say, I'm not ready to speak today, or just not speak, that's fine. We'll take a minute or 2 and that'll draw us back together in the end. Would you do that right now? Turn to somebody, if you've got a story, 2 sentences, just share the story and let other people share their story, and we'll take 2 minutes to do this. Ready, steady, go.